Take your company from good to great. Jim Collins' Good to Great. In Jim Collins' previous bestseller, Built to Last, he explains how great companies sustain high performance and stay great. But most companies aren't great, which leads to the burning question: how do companies go from good to great? And what do they do differently than their competitors who stay mediocre? Small caveat here: while I'm sure anyone can learn something from this book, it's probably most useful to those who already work for a company they would consider at least good. Now, that being said, this is the methodology Jim Collins used to answer the question: how do companies go from good to great and stay that way? Jim and his research team studied 3 groups of public U.S. companies over a 5-year project. First, good to great companies. These are the companies which had been performing at or below average stock market performance for 15 years before making the transition to greatness. Now, what is greatness? When Jim says greatness, he means a company that's generating cumulative returns of at least 3 times the general stock market over the next 15 years. The second group of companies were direct comparison companies, which remained mediocre or even dwindled, although they had the same possibilities as the good to great companies during the same time of transition. And the third group were the unsustained comparison companies, which made a short-lived transition from good to great, but slid back to performing at a level sustainably below the stock market average. Over the course of their 5 years of research, Collins and his team examined over 6,000 press articles and 2,000 pages of executive interviews. The goal was to discover what the good to great companies had done differently and thus help other companies make the same leap. Jim has this analogy for a strategy that good to great businesses use to clarify their business decisions. Finding your hedgehog concept will give you a clear path to follow. It goes like this. Imagine a cunning fox hunting a hedgehog, coming up with a plethora of surprise attacks and sneaky tactics each day to try and devour it. And each time, the hedgehog responds in the same way: curl up in a spiky, unbreathable ball. Its adherence to this simple strategy is the reason that the hedgehog prevails day after day. Good to great companies all found their own simple hedgehog concept by asking themselves these 3 key questions. What can we be the best in the world at? What can we be passionate about? And what are the key economic indicators we should concentrate on? At the intersection of the questions, after an average of 4 years of iteration and debate, good to great companies eventually discovered their own simple hedgehog concept. After that point, every decision a company made was made in line with it, and success followed. The hedgehog concept is about knowing yourself as a company, acting in line with that identity, and focusing on a clear goal. By asking and answering these questions, you can stop yourself from growing sporadically into several directions. It's about simplicity. When you look at it from a distance, good to great companies seem to go through a sudden and dramatic transformation. Success comes from many tiny, incremental pushes in the right direction. The companies themselves, however, were often unaware that they were even in the midst of changing at the time. Their transformation had no defined slogan, launch event, or goal. Rather, their success was the sum of tiny, incremental pushes in the direction of their simple strategy, the hedgehog concept. Like pushing a flywheel, these small improvements generated results which motivated people to push further until enough speed was gathered for a breakthrough. Unwavering faith and adherence to the hedgehog concept was rewarded by a virtuous circle of motivation and progress. Here's an example. Consider Nucor, a steel manufacturer that in 1965 was battling the threat of bankruptcy. Nucor understood that they could make steel better and cheaper than anyone else by using mini mills, a cheaper, more flexible form of steel production. Then they built a mini mill, gained some customers, built another one, gained some more customers, and so on. In 1975, a decade later, CEO Ken Iverson realized that if they just kept doing the exact same thing, kept pushing in the same direction, they could one day be the most profitable steel company in the U.S. It took over 2 decades, but eventually the goal was reached, and they went on to outperform the general stock market by a factor of 5. Comparison companies didn't strive to consistently build momentum in one direction. Instead, they were trying to change their fortunes with dramatic shifts and hasty acquisitions. When these didn't create the results they were looking for, they became discouraged, and they were forced once again to attempt to change direction, not letting the flywheel gather any momentum. Once you form your hedgehog concept, stick with it. That's the only way to see results. Good to great companies primarily use technology to accelerate their momentum in the direction they're already going in. New technology should be viewed as an accelerator toward a goal, not as a goal itself. But they never let that technology indicate the direction itself. They see technology as a means to an end, not the other way around. When a good to great company is contemplating whether to adopt a particular technology, they stack it up against their larger company goals and direction. If the technology could help them on that path, they will become pioneers in it. Otherwise, they'll either ignore it or merely match the industry pace in adoption. Comparison companies often felt that new technologies were a threat and worried about being left behind in a technology fad, scrambling to adopt them with no real overarching plan. Walgreens, a major drugstore chain, provides an excellent example of how new technologies can be harnessed. At the beginning of the e-commerce boom, the online drugstore company, drugstore.com, was launched amid major market hype. The mere perception of being slower in adopting online business cost Walgreens 40% of its share value, and the pressure was on for them to lunge at this new technology. Rather than yielding, they considered how an online presence could help them in their original strategy of making the drugstore experience more convenient and further raising profits per customer. Just over a year later, they launched Walgreens.com, which advanced their original strategy of convenience by creating online prescriptions. Drugstore.com lost nearly all of its original value in a year. Walgreens bounced back and almost doubled its stock price in that same time. I'm going to guess that you know that company leadership is important. Level 5 leaders drive successful transformations from good to great. But in Jim Collins' research, he found out how critical it is. Each company that went from good to great had Level 5 leadership during its transition. Level 5 leaders are not only excellent individuals, team members, managers, and leaders, but also single-mindedly ambitious on behalf of the company, fanatically driven towards results, and want their company to continue to perform long after they leave. But they're also humble. Far from being ego-driven, Level 5 leaders are modest and understated. They're slow to take credit for their company's achievements, always looking for an opportunity to praise their team, but also they're quick to shoulder the blame and responsibility for any shortcomings. I know this sounds like a magical person, but great companies are built by great leaders. Take, for example, Darwin Smith, who transformed Kimberly-Clark into one of the leading paper consumer goods companies in the world. He refused to cultivate an image of himself as a hero or celebrity. He dresses like a farm boy, spent his holidays working on his Wisconsin farm, and often found his favorite companions among plumbers and electricians. By contrast, 2 of the 3 comparison company CEOs had gargantuan egos that were counterproductive for the long-term success of the company. This was most evident in the lack of succession planning. For example, Stanley Galt, the legendary, tyrannical, and successful CEO of Rubbermaid, left behind a management team so shallow that under his successor, Rubbermaid went from being Fortune magazine's most admired company to being acquired by a competitor in just 5 years. The right people in the right place are the foundation of greatness. The importance of hiring the right people doesn't stop with the CEO and top leadership. It's also found that it made a huge impact when companies prioritize hiring good people throughout the entire company. And when hiring, asking who must take precedence over asking what. The transformation from good to great always begins with getting the right people into the company and the wrong people out of it, even before defining a clear path forward. That's because the right people will eventually find a path to success. When Dick Cooley took over as CEO of Wells Fargo, pre-scandal, he realized he could never anticipate the major changes that would follow from the deregulation of the banking industry. But he reasoned that if he got the best and brightest into the company, somehow, together, they would find a way to prevail. And he was right. Warren Buffett subsequently called Wells Fargo's executives the best management team in business as the company prospered spectacularly. Good to great companies focused more on finding people with the right character traits rather than professional abilities, figuring they could always be trained and educated. With the right people, companies never needed to worry about how to motivate them. They focused on who they paid, not how they paid, and created an environment where hard workers thrived and lazy workers left. And in top management, people either jumped right off or stayed in for the long run. Good to great companies never hired the wrong person, even if the need was dire, and hired as many of the right people as were available, even without a specific job for them in mind. When good to great companies did see that they had the wrong person, they acted immediately. They would either get rid of them or try and cycle them to a suitable position. Delaying dealing with the wrong people only frustrates the rest of the organization. Success requires confronting reality and never losing faith. Good to great companies constantly walk the line of something called the Stockdale paradox, named after the U.S. admiral captured during the Vietnam War. As a high-ranking officer detained in the infamous Hanoi Hotel prison, Stockdale was tortured repeatedly by the enemy. Not knowing if he would ever see his family again, and despite the dire circumstances, he never lost faith that he would somehow get home. Neither did he indulge in the foolish optimism like some of his fellow prisoners, who believed that they'd be home by Christmas, and when they weren't, they were heartbroken. Later, Stockdale credited his survival to his ability to confront the facts of his situation while still retaining faith. This is something good to great companies do as well. Confront the brutal facts of their reality, and yet still retain unwavering faith that somehow they will prevail in the end.